Good afternoon and welcome to Catalan Cymru revision sessions. This session will focus on history AS level and will be presented by me, Andrew Morell, from e-sgol High School. The session will last around 45 minutes where the teacher, me, will go through the relevant subject content. And if you have any questions, please use the question and answer section and we will endeavour to answer those questions at the end of the next session. I'll try and pool the questions together. The session will be recorded, with the recording and any relevant resources being uploaded to the e-sgol website in the Catalan Cymru section. So, welcome back to your third week looking at history AS level. Last couple of weeks then, we looked at question 1 and how to master it. We looked at unit 2, we looked at unit 2 question 2 and how to master it. Today then we're going to focus on unit 1 and how to manage the content and focusing on the concepts, which is the key to managing this content. Now these recordings are available on e-sgol on the e-sgol website, so follow that link and that will take you to them, and you can watch them then at your own leisure, or you can watch them time and time again if that's going to be helpful to you. So today we're going to look at how to manage thematic content and to focus on the concepts. We'll start then with a 40-minute discussion around that, with then 5 minutes of question and answers at the end. Feel free to post your questions and then I will be able to answer them at the end of the next session if I pull them all together for Unit 1. So during Unit 1, you'll have studied one, or you will be studying one of these topics. It might be Government and Rebellion and Society in Wales and England, 1485 to 1603, or it might be a slightly later period of 1603 to 1715. It might be Politics, Protest and Reform in Wales and England. It might be Politics, Progress and Reform in Wales and England in a later period of 1880 to 1980. It might be Political and Religious Change in Europe, or Europe in the Age of Absolutism and Revolution, or Revolution and New Ideas in Europe, or indeed, as I teach here in High School, Europe in the Age of Conflict and Cooperation, 1890 to 1991. Now, the first thing you'll notice there is every single one of those is at least 100 years long. And that is why it's called a period study, not a depth study like your Unit 2. So Unit 1, as I said, covers a period of at least 98 years. I was a bit off with 100 years there, wasn't I? At least 98 years. And it can feature a number of different countries or concepts, and therefore it's incredibly common for Year 12 to say that Unit 1 is very content heavy. And I get there's a lot to know, sir, that kind of scared look in their eyes. And I completely agree. It seems daunting. And the idea today then is to help you break that down. Because the crucial element here is that it's a period and not a depth study. So you don't need to know that content in as much detail as you do for Unit 2. Unit 2 is a lot shorter time period, and so you look more deeply at the content. Whilst Unit 1, over, as I say, at least 98 years, you don't look as deeply because you're looking at the general overview. The general overview of the most important individuals, most important events, most important terms and dates that are essential to understanding those topical or smaller issues. And it's vital then that the period study of Unit 1 should be looked at as a whole. And so you should look to make links and connections between and within features and characteristics across the whole time period. So how do you manage the content of Unit 1, which at first, as I said, appears to be huge? Well, the key thing is to focus on the key concepts. And those key concepts are cause and consequence, change and continuity, similarity and difference, and significance and importance. Now, you might be looking at me and thinking, what does that mean, sir? Hopefully, you'll understand that more as we go through today's session. So cause and consequence, right? Well, a cause is something that makes an event happen in the first place, the reasons for it. Whilst a consequence is the result of it, what happened as a result of it. So let's, thinking aside from our historical studies, what can be an example of this? Well, example could be the event of Russia engaging in invasion of Ukraine. Now, the cause could be that Putin saw Ukraine's request to join NATO as a threat. That could be the reason for this attempted invasion. Whilst a consequence of it, the results of it, is unnecessary suffering by ordinary people across Russia, across Ukraine, apologies. Now, it's not quite that simple, right? In history at AS, right? As there are always far greater complexities, it could be short-term or long-term causes, or short-term or long-term consequences, significant and insignificant causes, things that we can really say, yeah, that caused it, or things that say, yeah, it might have helped to cause it. Positive and negative consequences, they could be things as well. But nonetheless, that idea about identifying what the reasons for an event was and looking at the results of it, not knowing every single detail of the event, is a way to manage that content. So for example, right, Unit 1, Option 1, there in the specification, it refers explicitly to the main causes of disorder, protest, and rebellion, 1525 to 1569. So we're thinking then, what were the causes of the Wyatt Rebellion? Was it a desire to reduce Catholic influence by removing the Catholic monarch and preventing Mary from marrying another Catholic monarch? But you're looking at the causes of it. You're not looking at every single element of those protests, disorders, and rebellions. You're looking at the causes of them, and it helps you to manage your content. Same example here, right? Unit 1, Option 8, in the specification, it refers to the main causes and effects of the 1905 revolution. So what were the effects of the 1905 revolution? Well, it could be the establishment of the Duma Parliament. So it's not looking at everything about the 1905 revolution, not knowing about every single maneuver, every single person that was part of it, the main causes and the main effects. And this can be exemplified by an essay question, by an exam-based question for Option 1, right? How far do you agree that religious grievance were mainly responsible for causing rebellions in the period 1536 to 1554? So you can see even the exam-based questions, this is from an exam paper itself, even that isn't saying, tell us everything there is to know about the religious grievances and the rebellions. It's asking you specifically about the causes of that rebellion. Should be on highlighter, sorry. The causes of that rebellion. Change in continuity is another example. Change, how a trend develops over time. Right? Change is quite straightforward because we use the word change, in everyday language. Continuity is a bit more complicated. What we're thinking of here is how something stays the same over the time, and we need to know it stays the same. So an example of this, right, aside from history, is experience of university life. Some of you at the end of year 13 may go to university, some of you may not, but if you do, then you will notice a change in comparison to maybe your teachers or your parents or guardians who might have been. And you'll notice that change being that technology is increasingly used and therefore fundamentally changing the way that education is delivered at university. That's something that is developed over time. Whilst something that's stayed the same, something that's been a continuity, is that there's always been that shared experience of being somewhere new and a sense of moving forward with life. And that is shared no matter whether you go to university in 2 or a year and a half time, or whether you went to university 20 years ago, or whether you go to university 20 years in the future. So that's what I mean by change in continuity. Now, as I said before, right, it isn't always quite this simple when it comes to your history AS, but nonetheless, these kind of ideas are important. Change in continuity usually refer to attitudes, policies, ideas, and experiences then that occur across different forms of government. So an example might be here for Unit 1, Option A, the effectiveness of resistance and opposition in fascist Italy, 1922 to 1945. So what this is asking you to do is, and this has come from the specification, just like with the previous example, what this is asking you to do is think how effective was resistance and how effectively was it dealt with. So as resistance occurred, was it always as big a risk? Was it as big a risk in 1922 as it was in 1933, as it was in 1944? Did Mussolini always deal with it in the same way? Did that always have the same effects? What changes can you notice in how Mussolini dealt with it? Or what continuities can you notice in terms of the effect of how he dealt with it? And a question that exemplifies this from Option A is how effectively did Mussolini deal with opposition and resistance in fascist Italy in the period between 1922 and 1943? What he's doing there, or what the question is doing there, is it's asking you to say what has changed and what stayed the same in terms of his dealing with opposition and resistance. So you can see I'm not just making this up as mumbo jumbo, right? This is related specifically to the exam. Similarity and difference is another key one, another key concept. Similarity, how similar or how alike is the event to another. Difference, how different or how contrasting is that event to another. My example being here, from the real world, right? The anticipated release of the final series of Killing Eve, right? Something you might be watching, something you might not be watching, but nonetheless, right? A similarity between the anticipated release of other series, right, would be people just waiting for it to occur, wanting to know what the storyline is. Whilst the difference might be contrasting that anticipated release with other series. For example, with this series, it's almost taking a bit of a sour note with that, working with Russia considering the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so that's not something that we could say was similar to the anticipated release of the previous series of Killing Eve a few years ago. Something that's different, something that's changed as a result. As ever, it's not quite as simple as that when we're thinking about our history AS level. There are greater complexities, right? Similarity and difference compares and contrasts the impact, the success, the attitudes of something, crucially, both across time and across regions. So that could be across the time period of your study, or it could be across different regions within a country, or maybe even across different countries as well. So from option 3, right, in Unit 1, apologies, not Unit 3, the nature of the Habsburgs' reaction to the Ottoman threat, the effectiveness of a French reaction to the Ottoman threat in the 16th century. Key thing, taken out of specification that they say you'd need to know. So if you're thinking about how similar and different were the Habsburgs in French reaction to the Ottoman threat. The wars of the Ottoman Habsburgs could be seen as similar to the French alliance with the Ottomans, as they all sought to preserve their country's power, possibly. An example there. And so an essay question that exemplifies this is the reaction of European powers to the Ottoman threat between 1520 and 1570 was mostly unsuccessful. Discuss. So it's asking you to look at the reaction of the Ottoman powers. It's asking you to compare something across. So look at the similarity and difference across regions. Whether that's the French reaction or whether that's the reaction of the German or the Prussian Empire, etc. And lastly, significance and importance. Significance and importance, this is how worthy something is of our attention. Is it more worthy of our attention than something else? So what do we mean by this? Well, an event could be about AS exams and things like that. What's the importance of the significance of it? Well, how worthy of your attention is AS grades? Ultimately, they are building your historical skills, and there will be a grade that will remain in your qualification certificates. However, if you carry on into full A-level, then they'll just be subsumed into that qualification, and you'll get an A-level qualification rather than an AS-level qualification. So you're making judgments about significance and importance all the time, right? How significant and important are these AS exams to you, right? Always feeds in to your thought process. As ever, it's not quite that simple, right? If we're thinking about history AS level, there are greater complexities. Significance and importance need to be justified. Why are they significant, right? And to judge, you need to compare across. Why is that event more or less significant than that event? And so, Unit 1, Option 3, in the specification, it refers to the reform in factories and mines, public health, education, and poor law. That's something the exam board is saying you need to know if you're doing that option. And so if we're thinking about its significance and importance, we can think about how important was the 1833 Factory Act and the 10-hour movement improving the lives of the poorest people. Was it more or less important than, for example, the 1830 Poor Law? Both of which would come under this element of specification here. The Factory Act under reforming factories, Poor Law under reforming poor laws. And the next essay question taken from an essay written by the exam board that exemplifies this is this. Improvements in working conditions were the most significant reforms affecting the lives of people in Wales and England in the period from 1830, I think that is, to 1880. That's asking you to make a judgment on the importance of something, isn't it? So it's not about knowing everything, every detail about every reform in factories, about every reform in public health, about every reform in education in that time period. It's about making a judgment as to which is more or less important. So you're looking then at the importance of them, the significance of them, how it changes people's lives ultimately. Not what date was it passed, which MPs voted for it, what did it mean in terms of such and such company down the road, etc. And so those at the moment appear to be abstract principles, don't they? So what I hope to do next is to explain to you how to pull these together as a way of actually being able to manage this content in a way that's manageable to you. So the first suggested task I'm going to give you to do this is making sure you're totally familiar with the specification. And in order to do that, you need to go onto the WJEC website to find out what that specification is. And this link on the resources on Callum Cymru, this link will be clickable. So it'll take you to the WJEC website where you'll then search for history A/AS level and open up the specification, a document that looks like this. And by scrolling down then between pages 17 to 24, you will find for your option, whichever option you're doing in Unit 1, the specification, the content you need to know. And it'll look like this, right? It will have Unit 1, Option 8, or Option 6, or Option 5, whatever option it is that you're doing at the top, with the name of what it is, and then it'll give you the concepts and perspectives and the key issues and content you need to know. That is the stuff you need to know, right? You need to make sure you know all of that, but you don't need to know anything really that's not on that, because that is what the exam board are going to ask you questions on. They're not going to ask you questions on stuff that isn't on the specification. So my second suggested task then is within this specification to try and spot those key concepts when it comes to that content. So write out the 4 key concepts of AS history: cause and consequence, change and continuity, similarity and difference, significance and importance, and then categorize that content on your specification into those different things. And what I've done here is I've taken this from this section here, the impact of religious change, and then I've italics the key word in each of these that helps you kind of explain which one it is, which element it fits into. So the reasons for the dissemination of Lutheranism. Well, that is 100% a cause thing, isn't it? Reasons for. The beginning of the counter-revolution. Again, cause. What was causing this? Change and continuity. I wouldn't say there's any change in continuity in that element. Similarity and difference, right? The main features of the Habsburg and Valois rivalry. So looking at what's the same about the rivalry from the Habsburgs to the Valois household, and the same from the Valois household to the Habsburgs. But what's different? How is that rivalry looking different in the Habsburg household, maybe to the Valois household? And significance and importance, the impact of Martin Luther on the development of the German Reformation. How important, how significant was he on that development? You're making a judgment there. The importance of the Peace of Augsburg, right? You can kind of link there, isn't it? Importance. So by doing that, what you'll do is it will help you focus yourself on the key concepts and not knowing every detail about every single event. Where it talks about the main features of the Habsburg-Valois rivalry, it's not knowing every single detail about that rivalry. It's about knowing the main features, but also the similarity and difference between them. What are the similarities between these two rivalries? What are the differences between these two rivalries? Just a quick note here that actually some of these events can fall into more than one key concept, and that's just worth noting, that it can fall into change and continuity as well as similarity and difference, for example. Where it does, you need to pay a little bit of attention to that and make sure you're understanding it from both of those perspectives then, aren't you? Okay, So that's my suggested task 2. Suggested task 3 is to be familiar with all key terminology, because key terms help to show off your knowledge and your understanding of the area of study, as well as actually saving you time when you're in the exam. Time is tight when you're in the exam. By using a key term, you just use the key term, which is going to be 2 words maybe, rather than writing 2 sentences to explain what it is you mean. And so my suggested task to deal with this is to make a list of all those key terminologies that you've come across, words, phrases, that frankly you wouldn't have known without studying that topic, and making sure that you can define them, making sure you can give a good, punchy definition of them, and that you could use that word in context, and you could use it in a sentence when you're writing about the content, the topic that you're doing. So, for example, right, Unit 1, Option 2, the key words, key concepts that you might not have come across before studying this could be divine right, petition of right, ship money, civil war, royalist, parliamentarian, major generals, Lord Protectorate, propagation, deposition, glorious revolution, Bill of Rights. Without studying Option 2, you might never come across those terms. And so you can use and deploy those terms, as I say, to show off your knowledge, but also to make it quicker when you're writing your essay in the exam as well. So that's my suggested task 3. Suggested task 4 then is to do this, right? To ragrate, to ensure you're aware of your own understanding and your own weaknesses. So for each element of the content, I suggest, on your specification, I suggest you ragrate it. So for example, if you don't understand the content and the concept, you'd highlight it in red. So for example, here I put background to and causes of the Second World War and the effectiveness of resistance and opposition to Nazi Germany. They might be, after going through my revision, my notes made in class, they might be things I've identified that I don't understand that well. And that might be actually the first thing I go and see my teacher about or my lecturer about. But then kind of understand it, kind of understand that content and that concept. Whilst green is the stuff you do, and maybe the stuff that you're going to focus less on your revision, at least in the early stages where you're pulling all your notes together. So for example, right, it's not about whether you understand all the different alliances and ententes before the First World War, but if you understand whether or not that helped to a cause, helped to establish the First World War, whether they were more or less significant in establishing the First World War, whether the Triple Entente was more or less important or significant than establishing than the Triple Alliance in causing the First World War. By making that judgment and by understanding the content through that key concept, you are limiting what you need to know. But when you're ragrating, you're doing it through that idea. Do I understand it from that concept? Not do I know every single alliance and entente before 1914, but do I understand and know the ones that were significant in helping to cause the First World War? Because as I said before, if you were to know every little detail about everything that happened during these times, right, you would be drowning in all the information, right? Not even your teachers would know all the information. It's just impossible. That then is my suggested task 4, right? The 4th thing that you can do to really pull this content together. My next suggested task is this. If you approach each main topic through a discussion, so create discussion or debate. By doing that, helps us to focus attention on significant features associated with the topic or issue. And this should then help you focus your attention on what matters most in that period of study. This is possibly a task you might do with other people. By framing a question and then discussing it and debating it in maybe a pair or a 3 or even a 4, you are beginning to pull your information together, organize those thoughts in your mind, and possibly learn from other people as well as they air their thoughts as well. So what you could do in order to do this, right? In order to create these yourself, sat at home or sat with your friends in school or college, is by adding a question word, a why, a how, a what, a when, or a which. Then adding a judgment word, right? A main, a most, a more, to specific elements from the specification, right? To turn that into a debate or discussion. So, for example, one of the bits I highlighted in red would be the background to and causes of the Second World War. So if I add a question word, which, and then I use a judgment word, main, which was the main background cause of the Second World War? By engaging in a debate on this topic with friends or with my teacher, what I might do is benefit from a greater understanding of the different causes of the Second World War in the first place. I might also start to make a judgment and make links between these causes. And by doing that, then I am starting to really understand, really get my head around this knowledge. In terms of Italy, right, I know I highlighted everything in green, but it just shows, that you can use it for any element, right? The next bullet point down, the main threats to stability of liberal governments in Italy after 1918. What I could do, use a question, what, or question word, what, use a judgment word, the main, and turn it into a question. What were the main threats to the stability of liberal governments in Italy after 1918? So I'm making it specific to the content, the specification, but I'm turning it into a discussion point, which I can do then with friends or my teacher. And as a result, I am starting to get my head around the content more. So I'd be looking at what the threats were to liberal governments, and then I'd be looking at making a judgment as to which were the main threats. They can't all be the main threats, can they, right? Some of them have got to be more of a threat than others. And by doing these two, we're also linking back to our key concepts. In the first one, what was the main background cause for the Second World War? We are looking at the causes. Remember, one of those key concepts was cause and consequence. The second one, what were the main threats to the stability of liberal governments in Italy after 1918? What I'm doing there is I'm looking at the significance and importance of those threats. Which is most significant? Which was most important? So hopefully, again, you can see the need for these key concepts, pulling this stuff together. Another way, another suggested task to managing the content is the following: linking activities. Now, linking activities are very beneficial in allowing you to contextualize the content and to make sure that you're viewing it then as one big interconnected story. And what I always tell my students here is thinking about Sherlock Holmes' mind palace. When he goes into his mind palace, there's one video clip or clip from one of his TV programs of him going into his mind palace, and he's literally walking down corridors as he goes into different rooms. And those corridors are the links, and that's accessing that information in his mind. And that's what you're doing with a linking exercise. By linking, you become, or you prevent yourself from becoming overburdened with trying to understand each event in isolation. As soon as you think about it in isolation, you begin to overburden yourself because you're not saving time by thinking about the things that overlap. And these may also help to frame those discussions, those debates that I just suggested to you in the previous activity. By linking, you are beginning, so for example, right, the main background cause, or which was the main background cause of the Second World War, you are linking, by linking the causes, you are going to make it much easier to make a judgment on which was the main cause. So I've got an example for you here, right, from Unit 1, Option 8, and this comes from the impact of fascist domestic policy to 1945 in Italy, right, Mussolini's social, religious, racial policies, etc. And so the first thing I'd do, as I've got here, is I'd expand out on each of the following key terms after looking at my revision notes or the work I've done in class, right? So that might be defining what the Doppelvoro, the OND was, right? The provider of social entertainment, social opportunities for Italian working people, as a bit of a to and fro, as they lose their rights elsewhere, as they lose the right to establish trade unions, the OND is set up to reward them or to offset that loss of rights elsewhere. And then I'd be annotating between them. So, for example, and I apologize in advance for my handwriting, right? The ONT could be linked to the ONB, the Opera Nazionale Balilla, because the OND was similar to it, but a different age range. The reason being is that the Doppelvora, the OND, were for adults, whilst the ONB, the Balilla, was for the children. And they provided very similar things in many ways, right? It's things to do in your spare time, essentially, which is a link, which is something absolutely similar between them, just they were different age groups, that was all. What else could we do? Well, we could also link, for example, I don't know, we could link Anno Primo with the reform of customs. Because Anno Primo was year one, being 1922. No, 22, not 1992. And reform of customs being things that were trying to make people more fascist Italian. And so what you would do then was, as part of your customs, is you would be using it all the time. In your letters, they're encouraged to write year one, year two. This could link then to the Laterne Treaties and Concordat, right? You might, if you've not done this option, you might have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about, and that's right. It's the concept of linking these together. Anno Primo Laterne Treaties or Concordat, this was with the Catholic Church. Obviously, the Catholic Church used a system of BCE or CE, Christian era. And so they were going to, as a result, this was going to maybe cause a bit of and I'm trying to think of the word, a bit of a division between them, right? That might need to lead to the Concordat. Lead to it. By the Italian regime referring to year one as 1922, not as the year that Christ was born, according to the Bible, according to Catholic teachings, it was going to create a division between the two. And so it might have, or it did, need to lead to the Laterne Treaties or Concordat, which brought the relationship between the two closer together again. Unjustified celibacy, right? Clear links to the Catholic Church, things like that, could be linked to fascist women because they both had the same aim to increase Italian population. And by understanding these in a linked formation, it becomes clear in our head. The overall aim of this government then was to increase the population, and that was found in both the ideal fascist woman, right, as a lady who would be childbearing, who would not be at work, and unjustified celibacy, trying to prevent men from refusing to have children because they needed them to have children in order to increase the population of Italy. And I've got at the bottom here an essay question that could exemplify this, right? Did fascist social policy have the greatest impact on the Italian people between 1922 and 1944? A possible question that they might ask, right, that uses these kinds of ideas here. What essay question is essentially asking you to do is to compare these kind of social, religious, and racial policies, isn't it? To make a judgment on it. And so by making the links, what you're doing is you are creating an easier way to remember it in your mind, and you're more likely then to be able to make some sort of judgment in any essay question as well. Another way to manage content, right, is to do some comparison tasks, right? So my suggested task is for significance or importance of events you've studied, draw up the following to help you compare. Write the event, make this kind of judgment line here, and then you've got room to explain as well. So my example might be, right, reformation or reform and expansion of the armed forces, when we're looking at if you're looking at option 6, and church reforms, well, I would say that church reforms had a bigger impact than social or reform and expansion of the armed forces. And I would write my explanation here, why I thought so. Linking to this exam question, to what extent was reform and expansion of the armed forces the most significant element in the reign of Peter the Great, 1696 to 1725, in Russia? So if I'm answering a question like that question taken from the exam board, if I'm answering a question like that, and I've done these comparison exercises in advance, I already know whether I'm going to say it was reform and expansion of the armed forces, or whether I'm going to say actually, more likely because of my judgment here, that it's going to be church reforms. And I've already, as part of my revision, I've already drawn up some detailed explanation focusing on this, particularly on the long-term impact, because the long-term impact of something is really what decides its significance and its importance. For example here, right, for option 1, religious grievances, government centralisation, factions within the government, all things you're going to make a judgment on, based on this essay question here. How far do you agree that religious grievances were mainly responsible for causing rebellions from 1536 to 1554? I'm making here a judgment, right? Things that might have led to these rebellions could be religious grievances, or could be government centralisation, or could be factions within the government. I've said here, I've already made a judgment that factions within the government, I think, would be the most significant. And I'd have, as part of my revision, given a detailed explanation as to why. And it would help me with an essay question like that. And the way to manage your content then also, right, to keep your understanding within each concept and perspective. Essay questions will only be asked within these perspectives, right? They won't ask you to compare between them. So they will only ask you an essay question based on one of these. They won't ask you to compare, right? That won't happen. They won't ask you to compare that. So that can limit, again, your understanding of the content. And also in terms of your linking exercises, your comparison exercises, make sure you keep them to within each section like this. Don't, as I say, make them across these different concepts. For example, as I got here, you won't be asked to compare challenges to the monarchy across both France and Spain, as it's got as two separate subtitles here, two separate concepts there. And almost lastly, one thing AS students find difficult, especially with the Europe-wide options, right, 4 to 8, is that there are essentially 4 different stories to tell. There is more than one country, and so there's more than one background to understand, and in general there is more to know than ever before, and it's partly just that step up to A level, partly just what happens when you get to A level, unfortunately. You may also have been taught this chronologically, thematically, not necessarily chronologically. You might not have started at 1682 if you're doing option 6 and finished in 1815. You might have gone ahead a bit, come back, gone ahead a bit, come back. And so another way to help would be creating a timeline. And it's crucial to understanding the context, and so ease that burden of purely remembering facts by looking at that, by looking at the timeline and the context. You're not having to remember that this fact, then this fact, then this fact. It flows, and it's that mind palace I was talking about, Sherlock Holmes, as he's going along those corridors into the rooms that have got the information. And lastly, right, just note the content reductions in your option for Unit 1. So if you're doing 1.1, you no longer need, or it won't be examined on, the changing relationship between Wales and England after 1530, that bit of the specification. If you're doing 1.2, the impact of civil war on the nation will not be examined this year. If you're doing Unit 1.3, right, the growing pressure for parliamentary reform will not be examined. 1.4, changing positions of political parties. 1.5, the extent of the threat posed by the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century won't be examined. Same with Unit 1.6, significance of the main developments in Russia under Peter the Great won't be examined. 1.7, the significance of main challenges facing France. 1.8, the extent of political, social, and economic change in Germany. They won't be examined in this exam series coming up in 2022, apologies. So just remember that. Don't burden yourselves with remembering, revising that knowledge when it's not going to be examined on. The exam board have said, this is from the exam board, they will not examine that. So, lovely. That is how to manage content and focusing on concepts done. Next session, next week, we're going to be looking at essay writing skills and developing your reasoned arguments. So, as I've said before, please post any questions and I will endeavour to answer them, or I'll endeavour to answer them all together at the end of last session as I'm running over time a little bit. Thank you very much for coming today. Good to see you, and hopefully see you again next week. Cheerio.